Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, and once again, this is Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address the critical, sometimes contentious issues facing consumers and businesses today. It's legal information, practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of topics that affect your business and work life. As usual, we welcome our sponsors, who are from Audette, Bazar, Cordeiro, Grasso law firm in East Providence. To my right, Jackie Grasso, and to her right, David Bazar. Hello. Recently, we had addressed deadbeat dads and moms. Today our program is going to focus on grandparents, specifically grandparents' rights, parents, and the law. While we're not quite the Nonna or Grandparent State that European countries embrace, here grandparents obviously do still play a very critical role in family matters, especially since our economic fallout. In varying degrees, they offer practical, emotional, lots of financial support, not merely serving as just weekend babysitters. The question of grandparents' rights, though, has become very contentious. It's not just about a debate between parents trying to decide what's best for their kids. Now, merely visitation has become a legal battle, and it's gone nationwide. And in each state, since 2001, very many different states have come down on different sides of the law. Many have ruled against the existing laws protecting visitation. California, Florida, and Tennessee and New Jersey have all said that it was unconstitutional. And in New York, they favor it. So, as a good place to begin, in our earlier discussions with Jackie, she said, let's refer to a case called
Troxel versus
Granville. Why don't you set up the scene?
Well, that was a United States Supreme Court case that was decided in 2000. The scene is a grandparent wanted to visit with a grandchild. The grandparent's son, had passed away, so the mother of the grandchild had refused visitation. And they took the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said was that a parent's right to make a decision for his or her child is fundamental to anybody else's rights. So essentially, any state statute that provides visitation to any third parties, not just grandparents, they're saying is unconstitutional. And that was the result of that. And as you just mentioned, many states have followed suit and have declared the grandparent visitation statutes unconstitutional. Rhode Island hasn't gone to the state Supreme Court yet, so we still have grandparent visitation complaints that you can file. Same thing in Massachusetts. But until it goes to the Supreme Court, we still have a right to file petitions, or grandparents still have a right to file petitions.
So what we're talking about here in many ways is balancing the right of a parent to make decisions, which may be balanced against, in some cases, what's in the best interest of the child. Mm. And the other part of the issue is who has the right to make that decision on what the law is in a particular state. It's the old federal versus state law. And in many instances, people have really said that each state has the right to determine its own family law. It's not a federal issue. Mm-hmm. So that's why some states have gone one way in following the Troxel case, and other states have gone in a different direction.
Mm-hmm. Now, it may be just a detail, but maybe it's not. In that Troxel-Granville case, wasn't it that the mother would allow visitation but not much or not enough, and someone took an issue with that? So do you get to debate it on just and only when it has been completely denied, or is it we just don't see our grandchildren enough?
Well, I mean, you can debate it both ways, in my opinion, but in Rhode Island, you have to be denied visitation in order to bring a lawsuit for a visitation rights. As a matter of fact, you'd have to be denied 90 days, but this year the governor signed into law a new bill that reduced the amount of waiting time from 90 to 30 days. So if a grandparent has been denied visitation unjustifiably for 30 days, then the grandparent can petition the court for visitation rights. Now, if the grandparent isn't seeing the child enough, maybe the grandparent was seeing the child every weekend, and then all of a sudden somebody hit the brakes and said, nope, you're going to see them once every 6 months. So that answers your question. Is it just not seeing them or not seeing them enough? I think both ways.
In Rhode Island, there are 3 different statutes for 3 separate situations. There's one for grandparents of a child where the child has died and they're not being allowed to visit their grandchildren. Then there's one where their child's still alive, but he doesn't either have visitation rights or his visitation rights have been denied or he's not exercising them. And then the third one, which is really the grandparents against perhaps their own child and the mother or father of the children. So there are different statutes that address each of these things differently, and I think the court actually should probably look at those, each one differently, each situation.
Oh, and it's a question of facts, and you have to provide evidence that you have been unjustifiably denied, unreasonably denied visitation rights. You also have to present evidence to the court, or the court has to find that the grandparent visiting the child is in the best interest. So there's a standard that the court has to use in order to, adjudicate the case in favor of the grandparent.
It actually even goes a little bit beyond that in the sense that if it's the case of the grandparents against their own child and the spouse of that child, they have to make the finding that it's in the child's best interest, as Jackie said. But they also have to determine that there's by clear and convincing evidence, that the child has denied their parents, the grandparents' visitation rights unjustifiably. So in other words, that it's presumed that what they did is correct and that the grandparents now bear a heavy burden to prove that it's not.
What you just set up here, I think we need to explore in greater detail, but for a baseline, if there is once upon a time a very happy family with parents and grandparents, and the grandparents have been part of that child's life, perhaps even doing more than, as I referred to, just the weekend babysitting. Maybe they're taking the grandchild after school. Maybe they're taking him to the doctors, the dentist, the dance school, and they've been doing this. This is a pattern that's been going on for X number of years, and now suddenly something happens to the parent. It was a good thing or a bad thing. Now suddenly there's a track record that has been set. I guess that says it's in the best interest of the child, but how did they get to suddenly flip the switch and say she died or they divorced, and suddenly grandparents, you don't have any rights anymore?
Well, see, when the visitation is curtailed, especially when prior to the curtailment there was regular visitation, something happened, okay? And that something that happened is what's going to have to come out in court. But again, if you go back to the Troxel case, which says the parent has a fundamental right to make a decision as to what's in the best interest of the child against any other person, any third-person grandparent. So in Rhode Island, for instance, there's a particular judge that believes our United States Supreme Court has spoken, therefore grandparents don't have any rights. There are some judges that may think differently, but until this issue goes to the Rhode Island Supreme Court and it gets decided, you still, as a grandparent, have that right to petition the court. You just have to convince the judge that the curtailment was unjustified or the denial of visitation was unjustified. And you also have to show, by clear and convincing evidence, that there was a special relationship between the grandchild and the grandparent or grandparents.
David, for example, suppose you were taking the care of the grandparents who wanted to go to court. How would you defend? What would you actually ask the grandparents to assemble for documentation or proof that they really should continue their prior schedule, or I don't know if I want to say prior schedule, maybe that's going too far, but prove that they should still be having visitation rights? What would you say to the grandparents? What would they have to do?
It's like any other case. You have to have your evidence lined up before you go to court to show that each of the factors in the statute are met. So that, for instance, if they had a relationship with the child before and that it was a good relationship and there are benefits to the grandchild as a result of that relationship, you want all of those things. You mentioned whether they took the child to the doctors and they played a big role in the child's life, they went to their plays or their sporting events, that type of thing. The grandfather maybe taught the grandson how to throw a baseball, those types of things. Okay. So you line all that up against the parents. What you now need to prove unreasonable withholding of those visitations. Why are they withholding them? Is there any reason for that? If there is, you need to explore what that is so that you can set that presumption of reasonableness aside to overcome it. So there are all those factors that go into any type of case. It's all going to be fact-driven, and it's going to be a lot of different facts in different cases.
quite often what you find is that something happened in the relationship between mom and dad of this child, whether it be a divorce or a breakup of a relationship. And unfortunately, the children are innocent victims, so they curtail or terminate the visitation, and then it affects everybody else down the line, including the father of the child or the mother of the child, whoever has custody, the non-custodial parent, and the grandparents. So bottom line, something happened, and that's what's going to come out in court.
Right.
What happened? Is there a divorce? Are you not letting see the children because there's acrimony going on between husband and wife?
It could have been as simple
in-laws?
as some kind of incident between the grandparents and the mother or father that ticked the mother or father off and said, that's it, I don't want you in my life anymore, therefore you're not going to be in my children, your grandchildren's life.
So if the parents have the priority, they have the rights that supersede all others, do they lose, or does that become diminished in any way if one of the parents, or say the one who's denying the grandparents, if they are incarcerated or they're substance abusers? Now when they are saying, no, Grandpa, you can't see the child anymore, does the grandparent then have more rights than he would have ordinarily?
It might be different rights. There have been cases where the parent is in jail or has criminal issues or drug issues, and the grandparents have actually been raising that grandchild. And now the parent is trying to get themselves straightened out, but may or may not have. The grandparents, in some instances, may petition for guardianship, which is a very drastic in family court situation where you have to prove that the grandchild's parent, your child, is not should have their parental rights terminated.
Does it mean termination, or does it just mean that there's going to be a guardian in addition to the
So it's a
parent?
termination until such time as the guardianship
Yeah,
is
if they
terminated.
can.
If
Yeah,
they
I mean, but
can.
it's
Oh,
the
okay.
same standard
Yeah,
as
it
a
is,
termination.
yeah.
Okay.
There may be a situation where the grandparents have been taking care of the children for such a long time, they could petition to be de facto parents because they have done everything that these children have needed. They've provided all of that for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and now all of a sudden the parent decides,
it.
I'm able to do this and I want to take everything over and throw you out. Well, I don't think the courts are going to look kindly on that. So it's not just visitation, it goes beyond visitation in those circumstances.
What David is saying about guardianship became an issue after the Station nightclub fire. I hate to bring back old history, but a lot of the people that deceased in that fire were single parents who may have lived with their parent, and consequently, a lot of the grandparents were petitioning the courts for guardianship rights.
Right.
And often what happened is, because there's another biological parent, obviously, you have to give notice to the other biological parent. You have to have a hearing. Sometimes you have to appoint a guardian ad litem who's going to be like an arm of the judge to represent the child. It can be quite
Right.
detailed and
And in Rhode Island, on a guardianship, there's concurrent jurisdiction between family court and probate court.
That's right.
If it's uncontested, both sides agree, then probate court will take that. If there's going to be a contest or a disagreement between the parties, the Supreme Court says that belongs in the family court for jurisdiction.
And in Massachusetts, we have probate and family courts, the same court. So you would petition that particular court.
If a grandparent is currently taking care of that grandchild, do you encourage them to take it a step further if it seems that this could be a problem with the parent and they either have they ask for custody or guardianship? Do you encourage them to make something more lasting and legal if it seems fairly apparent that
Well, if
it's
somebody comes into our
irreversible?
office seeking advice, it's usually because they have been critically involved in the child's life for quite an amount of time. So what happens is, as a grandparent, or for that matter, a third party, it doesn't even have to be a relative, it can even be a sibling, in order to have rights to that child, sign them into school, take them to the doctors, get copies of medical records, you have to actually have either a signed agreement by the biological parent saying, yep, I'm going to give you permission to have custody of my child or guardianship, or you need to go to court and you've got to get a legal guardianship, because without that, the grandparent or third party, they don't have any legal rights. You can't travel with them, you can't,
And it's best if parties can work those things out between themselves.
Sure.
If they can't, that's what the courts are for. and the court will act on those things. But for the most part, in the station fire situations, if somebody lost a child, now they're raising their grandchildren, and the non-placement parent, the non-possession, they don't have possession, they haven't had much to do with it, understand that that's in their child's best interest and are willing to go along with it, they can work that out between themselves. But Jackie's right, you really should turn that into a court order one way or another, so you have some documentation.
Let's talk about money for a minute. Is it difficult and expensive for someone to go through that process if they're a grandparent and they want to make this more legal? And then on the other side of it is, suppose they absolutely flatly don't have the money. They're willing to serve the time, but does the court have a legal aid service or something that will let them have the representation without paying? If
Legal aid is overburdened and underpaid, and
okay.
so your weight is behind 3,000 or 6,000 other people, more so victims of domestic violence or people without child support.
But
So
Rhode Island Legal Services has handled these grandparent type of cases before, and they have attorneys there who are able to. You could go, if you can afford it, and you go to a private attorney, you know.
It expedites it?
It could.
It does.
The other thing
Okay.
I tell a client who has a desire to have visitation or custodial rights as a grandparent is not to expect that we're going to walk out of court in one day and you're going to get what you want. I also advise them that there is this Supreme Court case. It could be challenged. I'm not going to know the outcome. It's going to have to be litigated. If the judge decides no, then you could be the one to test that law. Maybe you can appeal it to Rhode Island Supreme Court, and that costs even more money.
Sure.
But it's how committed they want to be to the case. And again, we can't guarantee results. We can't guarantee results on anything, but especially in this situation where,
Right.
you know.
There's a lot of factors that can go into it to decide which way something might turn. Again, going back to the point is, if you can work it out in advance, it's the better way to go.
Yeah, you've actually mediated a couple of
I have
grandparents.
mediated some
Yeah,
of
he
these.
has.
That was going
That's
to be my
interesting.
next question, actually. Obviously, in all cases, if you can avoid the courtroom, all the better. So it can be mediated. And how does that actually happen, David, when clearly, if you're in a divorce, I'll give up the guns, you get the butter. But when it's a kid, it's a toggle switch of you either get visitation or you don't. So where's the compromise on a mediated visitation case?
It's the same set of issues that go into custody and placement in a divorce case. So if it's grandparents and their children, talking about the grandchildren, or grandparents and one parent of those children, you sit down and you go through the same type of mediation you would in custody and placement and visitation. So it's really actually pretty well designed for mediation to resolve those issues, because it's a lot of the same type of work you put into it. You try to put those two people in the other's shoes, for example, and to say, well, why do you want to visit on Wednesday? And a lot of times, well, there's a reason. And the other side said, oh, well, I didn't realize that. That makes sense. You get them to talk it out and work it out. So it's the same type of facilitative mediation process.
It's in a private setting and not in public
Right.
forum. You know, the other thing that I thought of as well, in Massachusetts, when people do go into court for custody, paternity, or divorce, you can actually make, as part of your divorce agreement or your custody agreement, a provision that the child will visit with a grandparent, okay? I'm not sure they do that in Rhode Island, because I'm not sure it's enforceable, but you can, matter of fact, the visitation complaint in Massachusetts actually states that you know, there was a mom and dad were married, they were divorced, but the judgment doesn't provide for any grandparent visitation. But you can actually put that in there. What's good about it, though, even if it's not enforceable, at least it shows the intent on the other parent if the other parent later passes
away.
on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a point well taken, too. I had asked you earlier, David, if you were defending or representing the grandparent, how do you present the documents, or what should you ask? What about the element that in some courtrooms they ask for documentation that shows that there would be some harm if the grandparent weren't allowed visitation? How could you possibly prove that? What would that entail?
Well, it's really going back to what's in the best interest of the child. So in this case, if the grandchild has spent time with the grandparents and all of a sudden that's cut off, you can show that that would be a harm to the child. How would you prove that? You would maybe have a counselor or somebody who's speaking to the child write a report, that type of thing.
Have the child
Okay.
interviewed by Family Services, have a guardian ad litem appointed,
Right.
and have that person speak with the child.
Right.
And you know, a lot of this is too about the age of the child. If the child is 14 and wants to see grandma and grandpa,
Right.
They get a vote?
Well,
Do they?
just like
it
they
should be
would in
considered.
custody.
It should be considered because they're mature enough to make that decision. Does the court have to agree with that decision? No, but it's strongly weighed as a factor in making a determination as to the way it's going to be adjudicated.
It certainly makes sense that if you have good grandparents, however you want to, loosely you want to define that, they can give some structure and they can give stability. And it would seem that if you suddenly yanked that privilege or revoked that, that there would be some instability. Is that in and of itself enough to say that would prove harmful to the child?
I don't think in and of itself it would be. I
would
think
have
you
to be
still
more
need
documentary
to
evidence.
have some kind of expert or somebody who would testify to that fact as creating a harm to the child.
You know, if the child's old enough, we as attorneys may even ask for an in-camera interview, which is a private interview between the child and the judge. It's not always good to bring children into court because it's a traumatic experience, but I've had cases where the judge says, I want to talk to the child without even soliciting that.
I've had cases where the child has told me, I want to talk to the judge.
Yeah.
And if they're an older, child, mature child, I think that can be helpful to both the judge and the child.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the grandparents and their rights. What about the parents now who say, I don't want Granny or Grandpa to be visiting them? Set aside that the grandparent is caught in the act of doing something that was lewd. Skip that. What other possible defense is there of the parent saying that the child should not be seeing Grandpa and Grandpa?
Well, the parents would have to prove that the grandparent is not a fit and proper person to
What does
visit
that
with
mean,
child.
other than being
You wanna take that?
Well,
Jerry Sandusky, et
Yeah,
cetera?
no, it doesn't have to go to that level, because remember, we still start with the presumption that the decision of the parent not to allow the visitation was reasonable. So that automatically puts the burden back on the grandparents. So starting with that, if I were sitting there as a judge, I'd still want to know what the reasoning is behind it. So they don't have to prove anything, but they would at least have to show some grounds for why they made that decision.
I think a good example of that would be, Grandma decides to move in with a Jerry Sandusky. Well, now you have a problem there because that is clearly not in the best interest of a child.
Or
there's something.
what if they come in and they say, I don't like my parents' set of morals, their values, how they live their life, and maybe it's not bordering on illegal, but it's totally different from what that parent wants their child to be exposed to. Is that reasonable? Well, I guess you would have to start with the assumption that it is and let the grandparents prove otherwise.
That's good to know. Now, you had mentioned that it's state to state. I was talking about the ones that seem to favor, those who oppose. With so much that is dependent state to state to state, does it not seem reasonable to you that this really does need to be settled and
does.
made more clear for whatever the rule is going to be uniformly? Wouldn't might I like to move to another state just to support the side of the law that state comes down
You
on?
have to go. You have to adjudicate the case in the state where the child lives.
Oh, okay.
That gets back
So,
to that
but
acronym.
are you asking if the parent would move to another state to?
Maybe they might,
Oh, I
if they
see
have
what you're saying.
custody, they might say, well,
it's not that
New
easy.
Jersey's
Yeah.
where I want to be because that's where they come down right now until
Now you're
there's...
forum shopping.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
That certainly tips the scales and
But
makes it not
we have
reasonable.
many laws that are state to state to state, and corporations do that all the time. Why are so many corporations incorporated in Delaware?
Delaware, of
right?
course.
Because the law favors the corporation in Delaware. So I think certain laws belong being decided by the state, not the federal government. I think family law is one of those that should be decided state to state. You have different rules in Massachusetts for who can marry than you have in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So people might move to Massachusetts so they can get married in Massachusetts, and they should be allowed to do that.
Yes.
So I don't think the fact that law varies from state to state is reason to make every state have the same law.
You have residency requirements, number one. you have the Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act, which says the child has to be living in a state for 6 months or more for a state to hear a case about custody or visitation. You know, the other thing people should know as well is that there are groups of grandparents that have formed coalitions and have advocated on behalf of grandparent visitation rights. And they're being heard. They are. They are.
Right.
AARP would gladly pick up
Right.
that mantle, I bet.
And again, you know, there are two sides to every story, so you have to weigh and balance carefully the parents' right to decide what's in their children's best interest versus the grandparents and perhaps the child's best interest in what a visitation should be. And when I say child, I mean grandchild.
In your experience working with family court, if this has come up to be something that you've had to address, do you generally find that a judge is quick to understand that this is clearly an issue that mom and dad are in a little hissy fit, and let's not make grandparents suddenly denied rights and child become yet another victim of it? Are they pretty good at cutting through that and nipping it in the bud?
Well, yeah,
as much as
they can read between the lines, but before you get to the grandparent issues, they have to get to the issues between mom and dad and resolve those first, because that's going to be primary in the case between mom and dad.
And again, remember, we talked about there being different types of cases. If it's mom and dad on the same page deciding grandparents shouldn't visit, it's going to have a different effect on how the judge may look at it. If it's ex-mom, you know, husband either deceased or not visiting, against the grandparents of that spouse.
Also, the non-custodial parent has a right to bring the child to his or her parents.
And the statute looks at that.
Yeah, they do look at that.
The statute says, do we need to entertain the grandparents' visitation petition when their child can bring the child to them to visit?
Perhaps this is too arbitrary to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. Suppose a grandparent has done nothing but support the grandchild financially, and something happens between the parents. Now the grandparent, one of them says, the one who's been supported, I want to now not only have visitation but custodial rights to that. I want to adopt that child or whatever. Does that stand ground if they were just providing money but no real personal, emotional contact over the years?
Yeah, no, that's totally a different issue than the grandparent who had that grandchild living with him or her or them.
So it doesn't cut down just to money.
Right, it's not just about money.
You have to show a significant relationship
Right.
between the grandparent and the grandchild.
That's good to know, because of
It's
course
part of what you have to prove in court.
in some cases you think about someone having money and therefore using that as leverage. There's certainly, this is quite
Sometimes
tough. Do you
what
have one more
happens is
last
they
topic?
close the pocketbook.
Say that
and
again?
then that's when the visitation stops.
Oh, close the pocketbook
Right,
and shut
and so then you could look at it and say, is that in and of itself enough
No.
grounds to deny visitation because they're no longer providing for the tuition or whatever it is that they were providing for before?
What an issue. There's certainly much more that we could discuss here. As Jackie indicated, if you happen to be a grandparent, there probably are many sites online that you can look to find out those rights, and grandparentingblog.com is one of them. We thank Jackie and David from Audette, Bazar, Cordeiro, Grasso law firm in East Providence. This is one of their public education and outreach programs. We hope that it's been helpful to you. We also thank Kenny Cool, our producer at Full Channel, for helping us. If you have any questions or suggestions, please consider emailing us at legalmatters@fullchanneltv.net. So we thank you for watching, and we hope you'll be with us next segment.